Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr., Chapter 2, Part 2. The sun had dropped midway between the zenith and the blue bulks rolling westward, and at the next gap, a broader path ran through it and down the mountain. This, Chad knew, led to a settlement, and with the last look of choking farewell to his own world, he turned down. At once, the sense of possible human companionship was curiously potent. At once, the boy's half-wild manner changed, and though alert and still watchful, he whistled cheerily to Jack, threw his gun over his shoulder, and walked erect and confident. His pace slackened. Carelessly now his feet tramped beds of soft, exquisite moss and lone little settlements of forget-me-nots, and his long rifle barrel brushed laurel blossoms down in a shower behind him. Once even he picked up one of the pretty bells and looked idly at it, turning it bottom upward. The waxen cup might have blossomed from a tiny waxen star. There was a little green star for a calyx, and above this a little white star with its prongs outstretched, tiny arms to hold up the pink-flecked chalice for the rain and dew. There came a time when he thought of it as a star blossom, but now his greedy tongue swept the honey from it, and he dropped it without another thought to the ground. At the first spur down which the road turned, he could see smoke in the valley. The laurel blooms and rhododendron bells hung in thicker clusters and of a deeper pink. Here and there was a blossoming wild cucumber and an umbrella tree with huger flowers and leaves, and sometimes a giant magnolia with a thick, creamy flower that the boy could not have spanned with both hands, and big, thin, oval leaves, a man's stride from tip to stem. Soon he was below the sunlight and in the cool shadows where the water ran noiselessly. Fix that. Soon he was below the sunlight and in the cool shadows where the water ran noisily and the air hummed with the wings of bees. On the last spur, he came upon a cow browsing on sassafras bushes right in the path, and the last shadow of his loneliness straightway left him. She was old, mild and unfearing, and she stared down the road in front of him as though she thought he'd come to drive her home, or as though she knew he was homeless and was leading him to shelter. A little farther on, the river flashed up a welcome to him through the trees, and at the edge of the water, her mellow bell led him downstream, and he followed. In the next hollow, he stooped to drink from a branch that ran across the road, and when he rose to start again, his bare feet stopped, as though riven suddenly to the ground. For halfway up the next low slope was another figure as motionless as his, with a bare head, bare feet, a startled face, and wide eyes, but motionless only until the eyes met his. Then there was a flash of bright hair and scarlet homespun, and the little feet that had trod down the centuries to meet his left the earth as though they had wings, and Chad saw them in swift flight pass silently over the hill. The next moment, Jack came too near the old brindle, and with a sweep of her horns at him and a toss of tail and heels in the air, she too swept over the slope and on until the sound of her bell passed out of hearing. Even today, in lonely parts of the Cumberland, the sudden coming of a stranger may put women and children to flight. Something like this had happened before to Chad. But the sudden desertion and the sudden silence drew him in a flash back to the lonely cabin he had left and the lonely graves under the big poplar. And with a quivering lip, he sat down. Jack too dropped to his haunches and sat hopeless, but not for long. The chill of night was coming on, and Jack was getting hungry, so he rose presently and trotted ahead and squatted again, looking back and waiting. But still Chad sat irresolute, and in a moment Jack heard something that disturbed him, for he threw his ears toward the top of the hill, and with a growl he trotted back to Chad and sat close to him, looking up the slope. Chad rose then with his thumb on the lock of his gun, and over the hill came a tall figure and a short one, about Chad's size, and a dog with white feet and white face that was bigger than Jack. And behind them 3 more figures, one of which was the tallest of the group. All stopped when they saw Chad, who dropped the butt of his gun at once to the ground. At once the strange dog with a low snarl started down toward the 2 little strangers with his yellow ears pointed, the hair bristling along his back, and his teeth in sight. Jack answered the challenge with an eager whimper, but dropped his tail at Chad's sharp command, for Chad did not care to meet the world as an enemy when he was looking for a friend. The group stood dumb with astonishment for a moment, and the small boy's mouth was wide open with surprise, but the strange dog came on with his tail rigid and lifting his feet high. "Be gone," said Chad sharply, but the dog would not be gone. He still came on as though bent on a fight. "Call your dog off," Chad called aloud. "My dog will kill him. You better call him off," he called again in some concern, but the tall boy in front laughed scornfully. "Let's see him," he said, and the small one laughed too. Chad's eyes flashed. No boy can stand an insult to his dog, and the curves of his open lips snapped together in a straight red line. "All right," he said placidly, and being tired, he dropped back on a stone by the wayside to await results. The very tone of his voice struck all shackles of restraint from Jack, who with a springy trot went forward slowly as though he were making up a definite plan of action, for Jack had a fighting way of his own, which Chad knew. "Sick him, Whizzer!" shouted the tall boy, and the group of 5 hurried eagerly down the hill and halted in a half circle about Jack and Chad, so that it looked an uneven conflict indeed for the 2 waifs from over Pine Mountain. The strange dog was game and wasted no time. With a bound, he caught Jack by the throat and tossed him several feet away and sprang for him again. Jack seemed helpless against such strength and fury, but Chad's face was as placid as though it had been Jack who was playing the winning game. Jack himself seemed little disturbed. He took his punishment without an outcry of rage or pain. You would have thought he had quietly come to the conclusion that all he could hope to do was to stand the strain until his opponent had worn himself out. But that was not Jack's game, and Chad knew it. The tall boy was chuckling, and his brother of Chad's age was bent almost double with delight. "Kill my dog, Willie," he cried shrilly. "Oh, Lordy," groaned the tall one. Jack was much bitten and chewed by this time, and while his pluck and purpose seemed unchanged, Chad had risen to his feet and was beginning to look anxious. The 3 silent specters behind pressed forward, and for the first time one of these, the tallest of the group, spoke. "Take your dog off, Dawes Dillon," he said with quiet authority. But Dawes shook his head, and the little brother looked indignant. "He said he'd kill him," said Dawes tauntingly. "Your dog's bigger, and it ain't fair," said the other again, and seeing Chad's worried look, he pressed suddenly forward, but Chad had begun to smile and was sitting down on his stone again. Jack had leaped this time with his first growl during the fight, and Whizzer gave a sharp cry of surprise and pain. Jack had caught him by the throat, close behind the jaws, and the big dog shook and growled and shook again. Sometimes Jack was lifted quite from the ground, but he seemed clamped to his enemy to stay. Indeed, he shut his eyes finally and seemed to go quite to sleep. The big dog threshed madly and swung and twisted, howling with increasing pain and terror and increasing weakness, while Jack's face was as peaceful as though he were a puppy once more and hanging to his mother's neck instead of her breast asleep. By and by, Whizzer ceased to shake and began to pant, and thereupon Jack took his turn at shaking, gently at first, but with maddening regularity and without at all loosening his hold. The big dog was too weak to resist soon, and when Jack began to jerk savagely, Whizzer began to gasp. "You take your dog off," called Dawes sharply. Chad never moved. "Will you say 'nuff for him?" he asked quietly, and the tall one of the silent three laughed. "Call him off, I tell ye," repeated Dawes savagely. But again Chad never moved, and Dawes started for a club. Chad's new friend came forward. "Hold on. Now hold on," he said easily. "None of that, I reckon." Dawes stopped with an oath. "What you got to do with this, Tom Turner?" "You started this fight," said Tom. "I don't care if I did. Take him off," Dawes answered savagely. "Will you say 'nuff for him?" said Chad again, and again Tall Tom chuckled. The little brother clenched his fists and turned white with fear for Whizzer and fury for Chad, while Dawes looked at the tall Turner, shook his head from side to side like a balking steer, and dropped his eyes. "Yes," he said sullenly. "Say it then," said Chad, and this time Tall Tom roared aloud, and even his two silent brothers laughed. Again Dawes, with a furious oath, started for the dogs with his club, but Chad's allies stepped between. "You say 'nuff, Dawes Dillon," he said, and Dawes looked into the quiet, half-smiling face and at the stalwart two grinning behind. "You taking up agin your neighbors for a wood colt, air you?" "I'm a-taking up for what's right and fair. How do you know he's a wood colt? And suppose he is, you say 'nuff now, or—" Again Dawes looked at the dogs. Jack had taken a fresh grip and was shaking savagely and steadily. Whizzer's tongue was out. Once his throat rattled. "'Nuff," growled Dawes angrily, and the word was hardly jerked from his lips before Chad was on his feet and prying Jack's jaws apart. "He ain't much hurt," he said, looking at the bloody hold which Jack had clamped on his enemy's throat. "But he'd 'a' killed him, though. He allus does it. There ain't no chance for no dog when Jack gets that hold." Then he raised his eyes and looked into the quivering face of the owner of the dog, the little fellow, who with the bellow of a yearling bull sprang at him. Again Chad's lips took a straight red line, and being on one knee was an advantage, for as he sprang up, he got both underholds, and there was a mighty tussle, the spectators yelling with frantic delight. "Trip him, Tad," shouted Dawes fiercely. "Stick to him, little 'un," shouted Tom, and his brothers, stoical Dolph and Rube, danced about madly. Even with underholds, Chad, being much of the shorter of the two, had no advantage that he did not need, and with a sharp thud, the two fierce little bodies struck the road side by side, spurting up a cloud of dust. "Dog fall!" cried Rube, and Dolph rushed forward to pull the combatants apart. "He don't fight fair," said Chad, panting, and rubbing his eye which his enemy had tried to gouge. "But lay me at him, I can fight that away too." Tall Tom held them apart. "You're too little, and he don't fight fair. I reckon you better go on home, you two and your mean dog," he said to Dawes. And the two Dillons, the one sullen and the other crying with rage, moved away with Whizzer slinking close to the ground after them. But at the top of the hill both turned with bantering yells, derisive wriggling of their fingers at their noses, and with other rude gestures. And thereupon Dolph and Rube wanted to go after them, but the tall brother stopped them with a word. "That's about all they've fit for," he said contemptuously, and he turned to Chad. "Where are you from, little man, and where are you going, and what mought your name be?" Chad told his name, where he was from, and stopped. "Where are you going?" said Tom again, without a word or look of comment. Chad knew the disgrace and the suspicion that his answer was likely to generate, but he looked his questioner in the face fearlessly. "I don't know where I'm going." The big fellow looked at him keenly but kindly. "Well, you ain't lying, and I reckon you better come with us." He turned for the first time to his brothers, and the two nodded. "You and your dog, though Mammy don't like dogs much, but you air a stranger and you ain't afeard, and you can fight, you and your dog, and I know Dad'll take you both in." So Chad and Jack followed the long strides of the three Turners over the hill and to the bend of the river, where were three long cane fishing poles with their butts stuck in the mud. The brothers had been fishing when the flying figure of the little girl told them the coming of the stranger into those lonely walls. Taking these up, they strode on, Chad after them and Jack trotting in cheerful confidence behind. It is probable that Jack noticed as soon as Chad the swirl of smoke rising from a broad ravine that spread into broad fields, skirted by a great sweep of the river, for he sniffed the air sharply and trotted suddenly ahead. It was a cheering sight for Chad. Two Negro slaves were coming from work in a cornfield close by, and Jack's hair rose when he saw them, and with a growl he slunk behind his master. Dazed, Chad looked at them. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.